AM 630. WMAL.
8:07 on WMAL. Brian Neiman, Chris Moody from Yahoo News, and this morning for Brian Wilson. Thanks for coming in. We've got Larry Kudlow from CNBC coming up about a half hour from now. There actually may be something that Congress gets done in the next couple of months, believe it or not. Things have been moving very slowly in Congress in the last year or so. But Congress is set to act on cybersecurity legislation. I think later this month, April 23rd, that week has been dubbed Cybersecurity Week, as both the House and Senate will look at bills concerning cybersecurity. Janet Napolitanto, the head of Homeland Security, joins us now. Madam Secretary, thanks for joining us. We appreciate it.
You bet.
Okay, so first of all, before we get in, we're talking about cybersecurity. We're talking about protection for power grids, financial institutions, banks, credit card companies, loan information, the whole nine yards. But right now, how big of a threat is it today? How vulnerable are we to cybersecurity attacks?
You know, I have to say that this threat, in terms of the number of attacks we're seeing, the sophistication of the attacks, has been growing very rapidly in the 3+ years I've been secretary. So, you know, when I testified in Congress last week and they asked me what are the impending threats, I have cyber right at the top of the list.
Okay, what do you want? What kind of bill do you want? How do you want it written? And who will have the burden of protection, private companies or the federal government?
It's going to have to be a team. It's going to have to be a partnership. The bill that will be a major bill in the Senate was called the Lieberman-Collins bill, but what it provides is for basic performance standards for the nation's core critical infrastructure, information sharing on a real-time basis, because we need that in order to mitigate threats, to deal with them, to help others who may be attacked respond to similar threats. And it clearly delineates the responsibilities divided between the Department of Defense and the Department of Homeland Security.
Now, Madam Secretary, how would you define a critical facility? What if a company or a privately owned company didn't want to be deemed a critical facility and be part of these new rules that could happen under one of these bills?
Well, realize that if you're core critical infrastructure, there's a huge public interest in making sure that your cyber networks remain safe and that you're sharing information on a real-time basis. We're talking about the nation's core infrastructure, which everybody relies on. Small business relies on it. Families and households rely on it. So we're talking about that part of our nation's private sector that also has a huge public responsibility.
All right, power grids, financial institutions, banks, we're talking about those types of institutes, I would imagine, as being the companies or what you're looking at in order to protect, right? Am I missing something?
No, you've got the concept. You've got it right. And we're going to, we know that we need to work, as we do now, with the private sector. But we also recognize, based on what we're already seeing, that there are gaps there, and that's why we need to have some basic performance standards that everybody is meeting.
Now, can you walk us through what would happen? Let's say this bill passes and DHS is partnering up with these private companies. Let's say they report that there's been a cybersecurity threat. What happens then?
Well, then we can immediately respond, as we have done thousands of times, literally, in the last years. Analyze the threat. We can warn other companies and make sure that they are protecting themselves against a similar threat. And we can put in place programs or things to what we call mitigate the threat. In other words, keep it from, for example, shutting down a utility, infiltrating the stock exchange, that sort of thing.
I know that the Chamber of Commerce has said that they would prefer not to require businesses to meet certain standards critical to cybersecurity. They want it to be more voluntary, to share the information with the government about cyber breaches. Would that be okay with you, to voluntarily share the information?
The Chamber's position was kind of reflexive. In other words, anytime you talk about having performance standards, the Chamber usually says, no, we want to do things on a voluntary basis. And my response to that is the response that we get from, for example, the chief information officers at these companies, that cybersecurity needs to be a core competency. This is something the public relies on. So the private sector needs to work with us. We need to work with the private sector. And this is the kind of infrastructure where we can't anticipate or we can't tolerate gaps in the system. We want the networks themselves to be secure. That's why everyone has to participate.
How is the setup right now? I mean, if there's a power plant, in say Pennsylvania, are they on their own right now? Is there any kind of relationship?
Pretty much, yeah, pretty much. And sometimes they'll tell us what's going on. Sometimes they won't. It's very catch as catch can. And we think that the public interest demands that for core critical infrastructure, what everyone relies on, that there need to be some performance standards and some required information sharing back and forth from the private sector to the Department of Homeland Security and vice versa.
Now, would there be sanctions put on these companies or penalties if they chose not to share information or report a cyber threat, maybe out of embarrassment or whatever reason they may have? What would happen to a company that didn't say anything or report anything?
Well, I hate to play the what-if questions. We think that when you're talking about the core infrastructure of the country, these are companies. They're large. They are relatively sophisticated. But what they're not doing is voluntarily supplying information and making sure that their own cybersecurity, on which we rely, is protected. That's why we need legislation here. And the legislation also does some other things. For example, the Department of Defense and Department of Homeland Security have divided between ourselves responsibility for the various government networks. The legislation would make sure that division is codified, it's in statute, it's in law, so everybody knows the rules of the road. And also, we want to build in from the get-go privacy and civil liberties aspects, particularly when we're dealing with civilian networks, and the legislation does that too.
When you say DOD, do you mean NSA?
DOD, well, yes, but I think it's important to recognize that the Department of Defense, which secures the military networks, and the Department of Homeland Security, which secures the government civilian networks, we both rely on the technical expertise of the NSA.
Okay. Do I see a scenario where you have actually NSA or government employees working inside these buildings with financial institutions, with banks, with utility companies?
Well, yes, but the reverse is actually, I think, something that is more likely, because we already have, and it's located in Northern Virginia, a center where we have representatives from, say, the utility industry located right there. So as we do get information, they can immediately work with us on what the likely response should be.
Okay, and are you optimistic that something will going to happen out of this? Obviously, there's some bipartisan support. I know in the House, Republican Mike Rogers and Dutch Ruppersberger, a Democrat from Maryland, are working on a bill together. They have sponsored a bill together. Are you optimistic that something will come out of Congress this year?
Yes, I think so. We've had some really good sessions in the Senate. I'm going to be participating in a session in the House next week. I think the need is obvious, and what needs to happen now is that the legislative process moves through and gives us some comprehensive legislation.
All right, Madam Secretary, thanks for coming on. We appreciate it very much.
You bet. Take care.
Janet Napolitanto here with Brian and Brian. Chris Moody in for Brian.